You cut into a watermelon you have been waiting 2 weeks to eat. You expected something sweet, something that drips down your wrist the second the knife goes in. Instead, you get a mouthful of cold water with almost no flavor at all. Maybe a little sweetness near the very center, but everywhere else, nothing. Just pale, wet flesh. If that has happened to you more than once, you are not choosing the wrong watermelon at the store. And if you are growing your own, you are not dealing with bad luck either. You are growing it the wrong way, and so is almost everyone else who plants a watermelon vine in their backyard. You have probably tried to fix this before. Maybe you switched varieties thinking the seed packet was lying to you. Maybe you watered more, figuring a thirstier plant makes a juicier fruit. Maybe you just gave up and decided some years the watermelons are good and some years they are not. Like, it is weather you cannot control. It is not the weather. It is not the seed. It is something happening on the vine itself, something almost nobody walking through a backyard garden ever thinks to look at. Here is the strange part. The mistake is not laziness. It is actually the opposite. People water their watermelon plants carefully. They feed them, they let the vines spread out across the whole garden bed, sometimes across the whole yard, because more vine feels like more plant, and more plant feels like more harvest. Every flower that turns into a little fruit feels like a small win. 4 watermelons on one vine looks like 4 times the reward for the same amount of work. It feels generous. It feels like good gardening. It is also the exact reason your watermelon tastes like nothing. And to be fair, none of this comes from a bad place. Nobody waters their plants too much because they are careless. They do it because every instinct in gardening tells you that a healthy plant is a well-fed, well-watered plant, and a productive plant is one that gives you more fruit, not less. Those instincts are not wrong in general. They are just wrong for this one specific moment at the end of a watermelon's life on the vine, and almost nobody ever tells you that the rules change right there. To understand why, you have to think about where sweetness actually comes from. A watermelon does not manufacture sugar inside itself, sitting there in the dirt. The leaves do that work. Sunlight hits the leaves, and through photosynthesis, the plant produces sugar. That sugar then travels through the plant and gets delivered to wherever the fruit is hanging on the vine. Now picture that same plant with 4 watermelons growing on it at once. The leaves are still making roughly the same amount of sugar. They are not working 4 times harder just because there are 4 mouths to feed. So that sugar gets divided. 4 watermelons sharing one plant's work means the sweetness gets spread thin. Each fruit still grows, but none of them gets the full attention of the vine. That is the part nobody explains at the garden center. Your seed packet was never the problem. Your watering schedule was never really the problem either, not by itself. The real problem is simple math. You let the plant divide its best work across too many fruits, and every single one of them comes out average. Not bad, just average. Forgettable. The kind of watermelon you eat because it is there, not because you are excited about it. This is exactly the problem that growers in parts of Japan solved a long time ago in regions reportedly known for producing some of the most prized watermelon in the country. And the way they solved it feels completely backward if you have spent years gardening the conventional way. These growers do not try to squeeze more fruit out of each plant. They do the opposite. Many of these growers limit each plant to a single watermelon, just one. Every other flower that opens gets removed by hand before it ever becomes fruit. Every small young watermelon that starts to form gets cut away too on purpose while it is still tiny. If you saw this happening in someone's garden without knowing why, you'd probably think they were making a mistake. It looks like throwing away most of the harvest before it even has a chance. It looks wasteful. What is actually happening is something much smarter. By removing every fruit except one, the grower is telling the plant exactly where to send everything it makes. No splitting, no dividing. From that point forward, the plant has one clear place to send its best work. Not 4 fruits competing. Not 3 fruits diluting the season. One fruit getting the strongest share of what the leaves produce. That one idea, one plant supporting one fruit, is the entire foundation of the method. Everything else you are about to hear is just the practical detail of how that idea gets carried out in a real garden step by step. Before any of that pruning happens, though, the work actually starts underground with the soil itself. Watermelon roots hate sitting in wet, heavy ground. They need loose, well-drained soil that lets air reach the roots, which is why a lot of these growers work the ground deep, turning it over well below the surface, Then build the planting area up into raised mounds rather than flat rows. That raised shape alone keeps water from pooling around the roots and helps the whole plant stay healthier from the very start, long before there is any fruit to think about. Once the vines start spreading, many growers cover the soil with straw. This is not decoration. It keeps the ground from drying too fast, blocks weeds, and keeps the fruit from resting on damp soil. It also helps stop rain from splashing dirty soil back onto the leaves. Small detail, big difference over a long season. Watering itself, even before the cutback phase begins, is handled with the same kind of care. Growers tend to water at the base of the plant rather than spraying water over the whole vine, and they do it early in the day rather than in the evening. The reason is straightforward. Wet leaves sitting overnight create exactly the damp, still conditions that fungal problems like mildew need to take hold. Water the soil, not the leaves, and water early enough that anything that does get wet has hours of sunlight to dry out before nightfall. Once a plant is only feeding one fruit instead of several, something else becomes possible, something that would actually backfire if you tried it on a plant carrying multiple watermelons. In the final weeks before harvest, these growers start cutting back on watering. Not all at once, not even completely, at least not right away. It happens steadily, a little less water each week, like slowly turning down a dial instead of flipping a switch. If you've spent years being told that a thirsty plant always needs more water, this is going to sound wrong. It sounds like you are punishing the plant right when it needs the most support to finish growing that final fruit. But a watermelon vine under mild, controlled water stress responds in a very specific and useful way. With less water moving through its system, the plant cannot keep diluting the sugar it has already built up inside that one remaining fruit. Less water flowing in can help keep the sweetness from being diluted right at the finish. The flesh often firms up, the flavor becomes more noticeable. The point is not to starve the plant. The point is to stop watering like the fruit is still trying to get bigger. That is the part most backyard gardeners never learn because it goes against everything that feels intuitive. Water is not making the watermelon bigger and better the whole way through its growth. Early on, yes, the plant needs steady water to grow the fruit to size in the first place. But past a certain point, once that fruit has reached a good size, continuing to pour on water the same way you did at the start is not helping anymore. It is just making the watermelon wetter and weaker, diluting exactly the thing you have been waiting weeks to taste. Some growers also say a watermelon finished this way has a more noticeable smell once it's cut open, on top of the difference in taste. So here is how the actual method plays out, from the very beginning of the plant's growth all the way to harvest. First, once the main vine on the plant has grown out several true leaves, not counting the very first small leaves that come up right after germination, you cut the growing tip off that main vine. This single cut changes the entire shape of the plant. Instead of that main vine just running and running across the garden indefinitely, cutting the tip pushes the plant to send out side vines instead. Those side vines are where the actual fruit-bearing flowers are going to show up. So this step is really about redirecting the plant's energy toward branches that matter rather than letting it waste effort extending one long vine that produces nothing. From those side vines that emerge, you do not just let all of them grow wild either. You walk the plant and choose 3 or 4 of the strongest, healthiest looking side vines, and you remove the rest. This feels like more cutting, more waste, but you are not trying to cover the entire yard in sprawling vine. You are building something smaller and more focused, a compact plant that can put real energy behind the fruit it is eventually going to carry instead of spreading itself out over 10 feet of empty growth. When the flowers start opening on those side vines, this is where most home gardeners just let nature handle things, hoping a bee wanders by at the right moment. The Japanese method does not leave that to chance. Pollination happens by hand early in the morning, while the flower is freshly open and the pollen is at its most viable. Once the heat of midday sets in, that window closes, and the pollen and the flower itself are far less likely to take. You take pollen from a male flower and apply it directly to a female flower, the kind that has a small swelling at its base that will become the fruit if pollination succeeds. This is not just about making sure pollination happens at all. It is about choosing exactly which flower becomes the one fruit that plant will carry for the rest of the season. Growers typically skip the very first flower that opens on a given side vine and choose one that opens a bit later instead. That timing matters because a flower that sets too early, before the plant has grown enough leaf area to support it properly, often turns into a smaller, oddly shaped fruit instead of a full, well-formed one. Once that one target fruit is successfully pollinated and visibly growing, the real discipline of the method kicks in. Every other flower that opens after that point and every other small fruit that tries to start forming anywhere else in the plant gets removed. This is the step where people tend to hesitate because it genuinely feels like you are cutting away free food. A tiny watermelon starting to form somewhere down the vine looks like a bonus, like extra harvest you would be foolish to throw away. You are not throwing away free food. You are protecting the one watermelon that is actually going to matter, the one that is going to taste like something instead of being one more average fruit, diluting the plant's effort. As that single remaining fruit continues to grow and gain size, you gently turn it every week or two. You are not flipping it over violently or moving it far. Just a gentle quarter turn, rotating which side faces up and which side touches the ground. This keeps the watermelon from developing a pale, soft yellow patch where it has been resting against the soil the whole time, and it helps the rind ripen and harden more evenly across the entire surface instead of just on the top half that gets sun. It also lets air move underneath the fruit instead of trapping moisture against the ground, which is one more small way the method keeps rot and fungal spots from starting where nobody is looking. And then in those final weeks, before you expect to harvest, you start pulling back the water. Not abruptly, a little less each week, following that same steady dial-turning approach until you are watering only minimally in the last few days before harvest, watching the plant closely instead of forcing it through heat or drought. Now, here is where people ruin it, and it is worth pausing on this because this is genuinely the part of the method where good intentions go wrong. The mistake is never the method itself. The mistake is rushing it. If you go from regular watering straight to a hard stop, cutting off water completely all at once instead of reducing it gradually, the fruit can sometimes crack open from the inside. This happens because the internal pressure inside the watermelon changes too quickly for the rind and the flesh to adjust, and something has to give. You end up with a split watermelon sitting out in your garden, which is a frustrating way to lose a fruit you have been protecting and pampering for weeks. The fix is not complicated. Slow down. Reduce the water step by step over a couple of weeks, not overnight. The same caution applies to that pollination timing mentioned earlier. If you choose a flower too early, low on the vine before the plant has built up enough leaf growth to support a developing fruit, you often end up with a small, deformed watermelon instead of a properly shaped one. The plant simply was not ready yet to commit its resources to fruit production. Patience at that stage saves you disappointment later. There is also the matter of how thoroughly that flower gets pollinated in the first place. A light dusting of pollen is not enough. Growers who take this seriously make sure plenty of pollen actually transfers onto the flower, because a poorly pollinated fruit can sometimes end up with uneven, hollow spots inside instead of a solid, evenly filled center. It is a small extra moment of care at the very start that prevents a disappointing surprise months later when you finally cut the watermelon open. People also rush the rotation step or skip it altogether because it feels like one more thing to remember in a season already full of small tasks. But a watermelon left sitting in exactly the same position for its entire growth will almost always show it, with that pale, slightly soft patch on one side standing out against an otherwise healthy rind. It is a small 15-second task every week or two, and it is the kind of thing that is easy to dismiss as unnecessary right up until you see the difference for yourself on a fruit that never got turned. And there is one more place people quietly sabotage their own results. They hear about the one fruit rule, understand the logic behind it, and then think, surely 2 watermelons is still better than 1 since that is still more food overall. So they leave a second small fruit on the vine instead of cutting it away. Almost every time, this trade does not work in their favor. Instead of 1 excellent watermelon, they end up with 2 average ones, splitting the same sugar 2 ways instead of 1. The math from earlier in this video does not stop applying just because it feels wasteful to follow it. Step back for a moment and think about what most people are actually doing instead of any of this. They go to the grocery store or a roadside stand and buy 3 or 4 watermelons at once, hoping that at least one of them turns out to be good. That is the real modern routine, not because anyone planned it that way, but because nobody is doing anything at the growing stage to make a single watermelon worth trusting on its own. And the result of that gamble is predictable. Half the time, at least one of those watermelons gets cut into, tasted, and abandoned halfway through because it had no flavor worth finishing. That is real money sitting in a grocery cart and real food ending up in the trash, all because nothing in the growing process ever concentrated the sweetness in the first place. Buying more watermelons was never actually solving the problem. It was just spreading the same gamble across more fruit, hoping the odds worked out in your favor eventually. It is the same pattern, really, as the plant carrying 4 mediocre watermelons instead of 1 excellent one. More volume, less certainty. You just move the problem from the garden to the grocery cart. One well-grown watermelon, raised the way these growers raise it, does not need a backup sitting next to it on the counter. It does not need 3 other watermelons as insurance in case it disappoints you, because the entire process, from the moment that vine tip got cut early in the season to the moment watering stopped in those final days, was built around making sure that one fruit actually delivers. You can even tell before you ever pick up a knife whether that approach worked. The little curling tendril near where the fruit meets the vine often dries out and turns brown as the watermelon ripens. The rind loses that shiny, almost waxy look it had earlier in the season, and the patch where it has been resting against the ground often turns a deeper yellow instead of staying pale. None of that happens by accident. It happens because every step before it, the pruning, the single fruit, the slow water cutback, was building toward exactly this moment. Compare that to the way most people end up buying watermelons in the first place, picking one up, thumping it, hoping the sound means something, and just guessing. The plant that goes through this method does not leave you guessing. It tells you plainly when it is ready, because everything it had was poured into one place instead of scattered around. That, underneath all the specific steps, is really the lesson worth carrying away from this. Doing less on purpose and doing it with patience often beats doing more out of habit. It is not about working harder in the garden. In some ways, it is about working less, removing more flowers than you keep, watering less than you are used to toward the end, focusing all of that effort and resource into one place instead of scattering it across 4 mediocre results. One plant, one fruit. All the sweetness gathered into one place instead of spread thin and diluted across several watermelons that each end up tasting like nothing in particular. That is not some mysterious secret passed down through generations of hidden tradition. It is just restraint applied on purpose at exactly the right moments in the season. And it is the kind of lesson that once you actually see it work in your own garden, you start looking for in other places too.